Welcome to a new wave of entrepreneurship. I'm Latifa Farah, Associate Creative Producer at Venture for Canada and the producer of a new wave of entrepreneurship. The focus of this podcast is to hear from changemakers and Canadian entrepreneurs to learn about how they've developed their entrepreneur mindset and skills. We'll be chatting with CEOs, founders, and successful business leaders about their career journeys. We're excited to dive into these conversations about how to foster your entrepreneurial mindset and drive.
I am super excited to have Michael Garrity, who is the founder and CEO of Financeit, on Venture for Canada's podcast, A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Michael, how are you doing this afternoon?
I'm great. Thanks for asking. The sun is out, spring is in the air. What could possibly be going wrong?
Michael, it's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast. And I've done a lot of research on some of your other interviews and writings. And one thing that you speak about is inspirational leadership. So what does inspirational leadership look like to you?
Well, I mean, at the very core of inspirational leadership is a leadership style that inspires other people, right? That would just sort of be the definition of inspirational leadership. And in startups, my experience, having done 3 of them, is that people want to be inspired, especially when the current path that you have is uncertain, as most startups are. You start with an idea, you don't know if it's commercially viable yet. Maybe you have an early partnership and it doesn't work very well. And so naturally you could feel, like your idea might not be worthy, but it's that second or third partnership where you've learned your lessons that ultimately drives your success. And all along that path, there needs to be inspiration that comes from a genuine place as a leader in an organization that describes where it is that we're trying to get to. Hey, I believe in you, I believe in me, I believe in this idea, I believe in this market space that we're in right now. I believe we can change the world in some small way. Obviously you don't want to be overly grandiose about that kind of thing, but I think we can change the world in some small way. And here's how I'd like to do that. And yeah, the path may be a little bit uncertain, but I believe that this team here, right, that you specifically, Scott, are a key part of what's going to help to drive our success towards that goal over there of us changing the world in some small way. And maybe it's a breakthrough in medical science. Maybe it's it's something that saves consumers money or time or hassle. Maybe it's something that makes a small business operate better. Whatever those things are, where an innovation is driving some improvement that's being made. Being able to articulate that and articulate it in a way that is genuine and in a way that has transparency to it, to the people around you, that sounds inspiring in the way that it's articulated. To me, that's the role of a leader. And it doesn't mean that you're overly charismatic or overly extroverted. Those don't have to be part of what inspirational leadership is. It's just coming from a place of like a genuine, authentic excitement about what it is that is going to be your mission and vision as an organization, so that you can explain that to people and recruit people around that idea.
Many young people are looking for authentic leaders more so than perhaps at any other time in history. There's a real embrace of leaders who show vulnerability, who show this authenticity. What advice do you have for CEOs or entrepreneurs on how to communicate in an authentic way?
Yeah. So, I mean, authenticity at the core of it is being truthful, right? So the single biggest lesson I can give to people is like, be honest, right? And don't oversell. I think a lot of us as CEOs of an idea, right, we feel like we need to oversell all the time, right? We need to almost overcompensate for the early stage of our company or the unproven nature of what we have. And I often see, especially young entrepreneurs that are starting things out, almost be overly grandiose in how they describe the company, its success, its metrics. The problem with that is that other people can see that as inauthentic, right? Because they can see the alternative to the evidence that you're providing, the antithesis of what authentic leadership is, right? And so truth and being truthful, you can still be optimistic, right, about where it is that you're hoping to get to and where your trajectory you think is. You just have to have a core commitment to being honest. honest with yourself and honest with, with the company and the accomplishments of the company to date. So I think, to me, a commitment to truth, even if you mix a certain amount of optimism and aspiration associated with the way that you communicate, you have to be committed to the truth.
A related thing to consider when thinking about authenticity is self-awareness. In essence, it's hard to be authentic if you're not aware of your own emotions and feelings. What advice do you have for entrepreneurs on how to cultivate a personal sense of self-awareness?
Yeah, and it's hard to do, right? Self-awareness is hard to do. I think start off with the premise that we are all imperfect, right? Broken in some way, shape, or form, right? That might be a great place to start. So you feel a little bit humble about not having to be everything, do everything, have all the answers. And then, self-awareness, for me, self-awareness comes from soliciting feedback from people around you. And sometimes that feedback comes from members of your team. So hopefully you have enough respect and mutual respect between you and your team members that they can feel free to give you advice around, hey, I think, you're obsessing about this one path, but I really don't think we're going to get there. And I think you're pushing everyone to the point where, people are stressed out. You need to be able to hear those messages at crucial times in your journey as a CEO. But you should also be getting that feedback around you and your leadership style and your approach to problem solving. You should be getting that from somebody else, right? And so I have a group of CEOs that I regularly chat with. Forums are excellent places for moments of non-judgmental honesty. Some people have a strong commitment to their faith, which helps them to see themselves in a way with humility and grace. Some people have great personal friendships or partnerships with a spouse that help them to get that feedback as well. I think just always listening to the people around you and soliciting advice from the people around you helps you to stay self-aware. And self-aware isn't necessarily, I think people often think self-awareness, like that soliciting feedback is a way to get more criticism and that could make you feel bad about yourself. I think it's just a way to bring in the information that's already out there and harness it in a way that helps you to be a more effective leader by being able to deal with it, right? And that would be my encouragement around self-awareness.
Feedback is a gift. It's an important thing for people to think about. It's always hard on the person giving feedback it's a lot easier to not give feedback than to give feedback. So
for sure. And we have to be good, but I don't mean to interrupt, but we have to be good at getting what's below the thing that someone gives you, right? So much of the traditional 360 feedback models from the 80s and 90s, they broke because people just went in and said, hey, can you give me some feedback? Oh, you know what? You're not as handsome as, you might think. Like whatever that stupid piece of advice was that someone gave you that is unusable, you have to be able to get below that, right? Like, hey, what do you mean by that? Like when you say, this, what do you specifically mean by that? What are things that I could do differently, which would have a different outcome with that feedback? And like really being brave as a leader to go and get that information. People are only going to give you a little bit of it, or maybe they don't want to give any of it to you because you're the person who's going to give them their bonus at the end of the year for being successful. And so why would they put anything in front of you? You really have to go and get that advice and be brave as a leader to get advice that will help you to be better yourself and help you to be a better leader for your team.
Many people get stuck in a sort of defensive spiral that they're given feedback, and particularly I would say people at the beginning of their careers. I think it's one of those things with more life experience as people get older, it becomes a little bit easier sometimes to receive feedback. But many people do get stuck in this spiral where they're given feedback and their instant response, they can feel in their body is defensiveness. What advice do you have for an entrepreneur on how to shift their mental model away from viewing feedback as an attack to viewing feedback as a gift?
Yeah, just the word gift is a great word to write down before you go in and have a feedback session with somebody. Like, this is a gift. This is a gift. They're giving this to me. They're giving this to me, even if it sounds angry or accusational or judgmental in the way that they're delivering it. I believe their intent is to give me something that will make me better, make this company better, make our vision mission better, whatever it is. And so I think that's the biggest thing. Like, you use the word gift, write it down before you sit down and have like a, in-person or virtual session with somebody. Secondly, it's been really helpful. I do a morning meditation on an app called Calm, and it's been really helpful for me first thing in the morning, to just get set for the day, right? And to be reminded of the importance of being present and being humble and being grateful, which are often themes that are in this morning application. But there's one thing that they come back to a lot in the meditation, which is that there is a pause between all of your breath, right? You breathe in, there's a pause, you breathe out, there's a pause, there's this pause. And that pause is like a thing to focus on, to say, people will say something. Your normal thing to do is to react because it's cause and effect, cause and effect. But there's actually a pause between something happening and you reacting. And the more you can stretch that pause out to give yourself time to think and contextualize and think of what's right, the more you can remove yourself from that kind of emotional affront, the better you're going to be at placing things in context and being the best person you can be in that situation. And so this idea of receiving feedback but not being defensive about it is to just remove yourself from it a little bit, to hear the words, to hear what the intent is, to not react to it at all. Maybe write it down, genuinely say, that's interesting, let me think about it. You don't have to react today. You can think about something and come back to it later on. Those are to me some strategies that you can take in those moments. And sometimes feedback is really hard, especially when you're stressed out and you're tired and you've got a whole bunch of other things you're worried about. That's the absolute worst time to get feedback. Sometimes it's the most important time to get feedback so you can make good choices.
Between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. This is not a Scott Sturck quote. This is a Viktor Frankl, who's the founder of logotherapy and a Holocaust survivor. And he was a remarkable, I highly recommend listeners check out his book, Man's Search for Meaning. And he talks about that as so much of our power as humans is how do we respond, right? That's really the freedom that we have in life. So on the topic of feedback, Michael, I'm sure over the years, you've probably given feedback thousands of times to different colleagues, and related to something I said earlier, giving feedback can be really scary. When I'm giving people feedback, it's something, depending on the situation, I can really agonize over, or I'll spend a lot of time thinking about. I would say maybe a little less so now, but I remember when I first started managing people, I would be particularly kind of agonizing. What advice would you have for entrepreneurs or just managers in general on how to effectively give feedback to individuals that they work in particular, individuals who report into them in some kind of way?
Yeah. So 3 things that I like to do when I'm giving feedback, right? The first thing I like to do is to start with authentic, positive feedback. There's positive feedback you can give to almost anybody on your team, right? I love how loyalty is engendered amongst your team. If you could have somebody who is leading a revolution against you inside of the company, a coup to overtake you, and you had to sit down with them, you could start off with, hey, I really like the loyalty that is engendered by people around you, right? You lead in a way that has people feel as though you represent their needs and wants, and you're the type of person that could be in action around achieving those. And I really just want to acknowledge that, right? Now, part 2, I'm going to give you some authentic and honest feedback from my perspective. And again, make it like, be authentic, don't be critical, be authentic and honest, but also keep in mind that you're giving feedback from your perspective. It isn't authority. You're not God, right? But it is my perspective. My perspective is that the coup that is currently happening in the hallways of the company is going to be remarkably destructive to value in the company that we have together. And I understand I'm not a perfect leader and I don't make perfect choices every day. But unfortunately, I'm the CEO and we're going to have to find a way to work together because our commitment is to our shareholder and to value creation in the company. And so, there's got to be a model that we can develop. And then thirdly, is to try to get people to your spot by themselves. Hey, how would you suggest that within the constraints of I have to be the CEO and we have to deliver our quarterly earnings, that we're able to address the fact that you're really unhappy and the group of people with pitchforks outside of the office are really unhappy? How do you suggest that we get to that same place that we both want to get to? Like, what are your ideas for us to be able to do this? So, the three-part strategy is start with something positive that's genuine. Don't make it up, right? Secondly, be open and honest around what it is that your concerns are. And again, within the framework of this is my perspective. And third, try to get them to paint a path to help around the final outcome that we both need to get to. Hey, here are the constraints. I'm the CEO, I'm not stepping down. And secondly, we got to deliver against shareholder results. That's our commitment to the board. Within those constraints, what could I do differently? What could we do differently to have that outcome? And then be able to solicit that feedback from people. And so, though I find that those three pieces, those three steps have been really effective at being able to get open, honest, dialogue and to have people be able to hear.
What happens if you do those three steps and then the person you're giving the feedback to still reacts incredibly negatively? They say, this feedback is garbage. This is totally unfair. I do not agree with this feedback at all. You talk to them 3 days later, they say the same thing. I don't agree with your feedback at all. How do you respond to that situation?
Yeah, so one of my favorite books, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, where the Ben Horowitz has got a position that basically is you're not going to turn around people that are not turnaroundable, right? That the amount of energy that you will spend as a leader trying to turn somebody around who has soured and is not stepping into where you need them to step to will ultimately just be an entire waste of your time and will show other people that you're placing your time in the wrong places. And his view is you just cut people, like you just got to move on. And it doesn't mean they're a bad person. Doesn't mean they couldn't be wildly successful working for a different company. They're just not going to be successful here with you, and you need to move on.
We recently interviewed Mike Wessinger, the founder and CEO of Point Click Care, on this podcast, and he used the phrase "red carpet in, red carpet out" and it doesn't work out well within an executive. What are ways that you think an entrepreneur can red carpet out an executive? In essence, have that executive save face even though they're being exited from the company?
In the cases where I've done this well, I have been authentic and honest and decisive around what needs to happen. Listen, this is not working out. We've given it a few shots. It continues to not work out. It's not you necessarily. It's not me necessarily. It's just not working. I have made the decision that we're going to end this relationship. And it's now up to us to decide how it is that we're going to progress to the next step, right? What I would ideally like, Scott, is for you to feel like and be able to communicate that this is your choice to move on. And that you would be able to, because I respect you as an executive, you would be able to be proactive in that communication and be able to, move forward. The paperwork will be what it will need to be in order for us to adequately meet up with our obligation around severance. And we can make sure that that's a parallel track. But I'd ultimately like you to be in control of this communication. If you choose that that's not the case, then we'll probably make Friday your last day, and I'll communicate out both my respect and thanks for your time here and the fact that we're moving on from you. And I found that in those circumstances where I've done it right, And I've been definitive and not wishy-washy, and not have people who naturally want to come back and say, I think we can salvage this, whatever. And then I give them another shot. That's always the wrong decision. When you've made a decision, and you hold the line and you're respectful about it. I find 9 times out of 10, the people will say, okay, I will be proactive in letting people know that I'm choosing to move on, and none of those things will affect the severance package that you're obligated to provide me, and we'll move on from there.
That was really helpful, tangible advice. I've often heard that, okay, exit people with honor and grace, but then people don't provide specific, tangible advice. That was very specific and very good. So thank you for sharing that. I think it's really helpful advice. And one of the things I think that's also important for entrepreneurs or leaders to think about is, what are the negative consequences when a senior executive or senior person in an organization just disappears, which, to your point, it sometimes happens. So what are, Michael, what are some of the benefits in terms of organizational culture of doing what you just described? So of giving that person kind of control over communications, publicly communicating that it was their choice. How does that positively impact your relationships with the executive team, the company culture in general?
Yeah, I think everyone will judge you positively or negatively on how you treat other people, right? And so, your team will know when something's not working out, right? When you've got an executive where you're at loggerheads, where they're not producing in the way that the organization expects, where they're, they've kind of soured on their connection to the mission and vision of the company, whatever it happens to be. Everybody knows when that's happening. And sometimes it can be, like quite contentious inside of an organization. So first of all, people are judging your ability to address that. Letting that go is infectious to your organization. It discounts you as an effective leader, right? In the minds of the people around you, either because you're avoiding the conflict, you're not seeing the conflict, you're not seeing how it's ruining the culture that you care about. So, part of that is that you address things front and center, and people will appreciate you even if you make a hard choice, right? And it's always hard choices in these things. People respect the fact that you made a hard choice and that you stuck to it, right? Because your commitment is the success of the company. It's not your ego. Secondly, people will see how you treated that person. And even if it costs the company a little more, and you lose time because you let somebody wind out of the organization instead of just marching them out the door with a box. I mean, it's different if there's like some gross violation of a moral issue in the company. That's very rare, but in that case, you march them out with a box. But in the case that it's just people can't find that connection, or it's someone who's just not the right fit for an organization, letting them have their pride and make their own announcements, even if people know, yeah, that person was like pushed out, letting them have that, respecting them enough to let them own the communication, I think is generally seen by other people as very positive.
Whenever someone is exited from a company, for the existing employees, the first thing they think about isn't the person who just got let go, it's themselves. And which is that's just human nature. We're self-interested creatures. And I think to your point, when you treat somebody with care, it sends a message to the existing employees that they will be taught with or treated with care. You've spoken in other interviews, Michael, about the importance of effective communication and authentic communication as a CEO. And I think an often underappreciated aspect of communication is listening, and listening really actively. And one thing I have observed sometimes in my work with Venture for Canada is entrepreneurs are often these gregarious, very sales-focused people who are sometimes great at verbal communication, but at times cannot be the best listeners to their own detriment. And I say this from my own self. One thing I work on a lot is how to better actively listen. Hosting this podcast has actually been a good learning, because when you interview people, you really have to listen for what they're saying. So what advice do you have for CEOs, leaders, entrepreneurs on how to be better listeners?
Get married. That's my number one piece. It is like a daily training ground. getting better at listening to avoid conflict. But in all seriousness, yeah, look, especially for people that are like me, are extroverted and want to talk, right? And have things that I feel, rightly or wrongly, that are things that are important to say. That personality, like I think it's easier for introverts to be great listeners because that's in their DNA, to be a great listener, to harmonize information, to find a personal connection with somebody that's meaningful, as opposed to going into a room and being big and having things to say. I think that there are times for us to exercise our strength muscle as extroverts and sort of people that are salesy and naturally salesy as CEOs. Not all of us are, but like for us, there are times that we have to exercise that strength, and that's usually very natural for us. A town hall, investor presentation, whatever it is. Then there's other times where we actually have to do the hard work of being more introverted and being more listening oriented. And what's the client really telling me about their needs? I can tell them what I want to sell them, but the more important thing is to hear what their needs are, and then to find a way to pull the 4 things of the 10 I could have told them about my product and laser focus those on their needs instead of all 10 things and they've tuned out a long time ago. Right. In the same way that an introvert has to pull themselves up. You and I were talking earlier about Winston Churchill. He was an introvert, right? It took everything he had to make big, powerful speeches, but he did them. And they are some of the most memorable speeches in English history. But he had to bring himself to that point. For those of us who are big extroverts, to your question, we got to bring ourselves down to kind of listen and to connect with people on a one-to-one basis in a way that will help us.
There's a great insight from a book called Titan by Ron Chernow. That's a biography of John Rockefeller, who is arguably the most successful entrepreneur of all time. And many people would be surprised when they would go to meetings with John Rockefeller, because he would go to these meetings and he just wouldn't say a word. He'd just sit there and listen the entire time. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about. I agree. There's certain points where talking is needed, and I think CEOs shouldn't just sit back and listen all the time. But I do think that, particularly in our culture, in Western North American culture, listening, not just amongst CEOs and entrepreneurs and leaders, but amongst the general population, is something that is often very underappreciated. In some ways, a lost art.
Yeah, and if I could just put a qualification on that, it's listening non-judgmentally. It's listening to learn as opposed to listening to pick your point of attack, right? And that's a different type of, like, I think you used the term active listening. I'll widen that out for me and say it's active, non-judgmental listening with the intent of learning something that I don't know. And I should go in with the assumption that the most information that exists in the world, I currently don't know.
Someone once said to me that there's 2 broad types of listening. There's listening to understand, and there's listening to respond. And you can see it in people when they just say, they're just waiting, right? They have a point and they're just waiting to respond.
There's that point. There's your inconsistency, right? That's not active, positive listening, right? That's listening for the wrong intent. So yes, I agree with you.
And your point about the non-judgmental active listening, when people are trained to be therapists or social workers, it's a core focus of that whole sector of work, is how to cultivate that non-judgmental active listening. And it's really hard. It's not an easy thing. I'm far from an expert in it, but I think it's something that is really is important. And I think your point, Michael, about it being non-judgmental is so critical, because there is such a natural human instinct to judge. And I think when you're an entrepreneur and a leader, you're making judgments all the time. So it's really easy to get into a judgment frame of mind.
Yeah, and again, making judgments, being a decision maker and decisive at times is your greatest strength, right? And then you just have to shift gears and find ways of not being that personality at times. And I heard an interesting stat. I don't know if it's true or not, but the stat was 90% of founder CEOs never make it to the terminal event of their company. And I can totally see that in my own experience, where the qualities that you need to get something started, 0 to 1, are often a very different set of qualities to take something from 1 to 10 or from 10 to 100. And so, during that path, there's a different set of skills. There's a different set of you. You don't have to be someone that you're not. You just have to pull on a set of experiences and ways of behaving that are different necessarily from the different stages of your company, right? And different parts of you. And some parts of you are unrefined and need some work in order for you to make them successful. And that's where a management coach or a therapist or getting married will help you.
Really interesting insights today, Michael, on a really wide range of topics, from how to cultivate inspirational leadership to how to be authentic, to how to give feedback, to how to exit senior leaders with grace. We've covered a really wide range of topics. It's been really interesting chatting with you today, Michael. Thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks, Scott.
That's it for this week's episode of A New Wave of Entrepreneurship. Stay connected with us via our social and our email list. Subscribe to us in your favorite podcast app so that you don't miss our next episode. If you have feedback on today's episode, tweet us at Venture4Canada. That is Venture, the number 4, Canada, or email us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. I'm Scott Stewart, and until next time, stay safe, stay motivated, and stay grateful. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is produced by Latifa Farah. Editing and mixing also done by Latifa Farah. Erica Ormanston is our editorial assistant. Mark Wallach and Premium Beat own the copyright and publishing rights related to the song used in this podcast. The comments and opinions, recommendations, or suggestions expressed on the podcast by the guests are not liable to Venture for Canada and belong solely to each individual. Any information provided stated by our guests and our host is independent of Venture for Canada. A New Wave of Entrepreneurship is a Venture for Canada brand, and all content is owned by Venture for Canada. If you'd like to use our content, please reach out to us at podcast@venture4, that's spelled FOR, Canada.ca.